Biography Special, brought to you in part by Zoloft and by State Farm Insurance. From A&E, this is Biography. For July 15th, 2002, Biography with Harry Smith.
Bill Graham, the P.T. Barnum of rock and roll, who redefined forever the word concert. Welcome to our special biography milestone. After 15 years of bringing you the famous and the infamous, our 1,000th biography is the quirky, charismatic rock and roll promoter, Bill Graham. Graham didn't invent rock and roll, but he did invent the modern rock concert. He launched the careers of such legends as Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, and many others. He told Carlos Santana that when playing, give it all your heart. If you're gonna die, die on the line. For over 25 years, under Graham's flamboyant style, his company, Bill Graham Presents, guaranteed the greatest show in rock and roll.
There's not too many miracles available in modern society. People don't have the heart or the stomach for them. Bill Graham, in his own way, created miracles because the audience never knew what to expect.
Well, the Fillmore had a certain kind of magical air to it. There was something about it. I can't really explain it. I can smell it. It was a funky, funky place. It was a place you really got down and played some serious music. There was no pretense in the Fillmore.
The Young Rascals were at the top of the bill. The Sopwith Camel were next. And from Los Angeles, a band called The Doors. And Jim said, start with the music's over.
And then DJ Morris would come over here and say, turn off the lights. No, I'm serious, turn off the lights, man. God damn it, turn off the lights. So they turn off the lights, pitch black, and then he goes.
Morrison screams, Robbie hits a big E minor chord on his guitar, and the entire Fillmore audience, pow! You could feel the love.
The whole thing about the Fillmore, on one level that Bill created, was that it didn't almost matter who was on stage at the Fillmore. People came to go to the Fillmore.
It was a place for magic, mystery, and Dionysian revelry. It became an Aladdin's castle. It became the domain of Merlin. Bill Graham believed in opening the doors of perception.
Ladies and gentlemen, a man who doesn't play guitar, but he gives great stadium. Please welcome Mr. Bill Graham.
In the late 1960s and the early 70s, the music scene in San Francisco was like a three-ring circus, and Bill Graham was its ringleader. By the time he finished his more than 25-year journey through rock and roll, Graham had redefined the way concerts were presented throughout the world.
Hey, no, this is not a promoter. This is, what do you call it? Impresario.
He was the greatest concert producer in the history of rock throughout his career. There's no question about that. There was nobody to match him.
From San Francisco and points north, south, east, and west, let's welcome, please, Santana.
He took pride in always saying, my apron is clean, the water is pure, the flowers are fresh, my smile is sincere, I hope you're hungry. Because I got the best food in the city. And to him, the food was the music and the musicians.
He loved to be around musicians, be hanging with musicians. He liked to be where the energy musically was happening.
Girl, make up your mind before it's too late.
How do you do? He had total control of the whole production. You know, so it wasn't just booking the act. He was involved in every aspect of the show.
He would be in a trance for like 45 minutes, making sure everything was perfect. The concessions, the chairs, the this, the that, the PA, and he would be sweating, getting it all together, and all of a sudden he'd just smile and open the doors. I saw that one time, and man, that really resonated. I never forgot that, how much he really, really cared.
When you walked onto a Bill Graham stage, the most amazing thing to me was people would be standing there. Everything was ready. The stage is yours.
Graham understands musicians, and that's really important to musicians. Most promoters don't care anything except 2 45-minute sets, $6,500. They refuse to relate in any other terms.
But the price Graham exacted for his devotion was to make sure artists lived up to a singular sense of purpose.
He wanted the artists to give the fans everything that they deserved, and so he would yell at Jimi Hendrix as much as he would yell at some drug-crazed fool that's causing a problem.
When he was yelling, "You no good mother," and yelling and screaming, everybody's got a Bill Graham yelling at him story.
He could levitate stuff with his temper.
Next time you say on me, I hope it's out there somewhere with no cameras around. I'll take your teeth out of your mouth and shove them through your nose.
You always talk like this, let me tell you, mister, I'm going to...
He threw me off the stage one time. He was so outraged. We were late and looking for me, and I came walking on. He's throwing people off the stage. He threw me out the door. Then he's yelling for me, "Where's Marty?"
It's about time I told you how I felt. Because all week long, you're making demands on me, and I'm getting on my knees. I'm tired of getting on my knees.
The darkest hour. It's always, I believe it's always just before the dawn.
That involuntary sense of anger on his part, extreme anger, was not something that was pleasant for him, and it wasn't something he could control. He once told me that anger is what the gods gave people just before they were going to destroy them.
Bill Graham was an amalgam of the entire range of human emotions. He was everything from an actor while doing business to a tough businessman who knew how to use acting to support the business side of things. He was a softie, and he was the hardest guy that could be in the world.
He's a very colorful, very flamboyant, very dramatic, theatrical personality, larger than life.
Nobody wanted to be an entrepreneur, and Bill was willing to stand up in front of everything that he did and say, "I present." It was always Bill Graham presents, very important to him.
The Bill Graham brand stood for the best of rock and roll. It opened the doors for a generation of fans looking for the next musical wave after Elvis and the Beatles. A wave that Graham rode with an intense swagger, born out of a struggle to survive that defined his life.
It seemed to me that he was compensating for a life of loneliness, a life of struggle, a life of not having anybody take care of him. So what's boggling to the mind was that somebody who, didn't necessarily have anybody holding his hand through life was able to hold the hands of 50,000 people at one time.
Without Bill, there would be no rock and roll as we know it now. He came to America with nothing, and he created himself from scratch. Did a really good job with some parts, and he did a really bad job with others.
You are watching Bill Graham on Biography.
Bill Graham had a remarkable trip to the top of the rock and roll promotion business. To those who knew him best, his harrowing journey from pre-World War II Berlin to America created not only a non-stop desire to make something of himself, but a fragile inner persona that became ingrained in his psyche. Through and through, Bill Graham was self-made. Not even his name was original.
His name is Wolfgang Grajunza, which is the proper pronunciation of what seems to be spelled Grajunka. My sense is that within the house he's known as Wolfie.
A Jewish child of Eastern European descent, Graham's father died shortly after his birth in 1931. Leaving his mother and 5 older sisters to endure the horrors of the mounting Nazi campaign. When he was 6, Bill's mother orchestrated his escape when she placed him and his 8-year-old sister Tola in a German orphanage.
In '39, I was living in an orphanage in Berlin, and there was an exchange with a French orphanage. When Germany invaded France, the Red Cross sent someone to get us, and we joined the rest of civilization and just marched south.
But the children and their escorts were trapped in France and would have to spend the next 2 years hiding in the French countryside.
They would have air raids, and they would have to go overnight sometimes, or for 2 days sometimes, into ditches, and they would cover them over, and they would be hungry, and they would be cold, and there would be things crawling out of the dirt. And it's just so sad to me to think of a little kid being so alone and so scared.
They're getting on buses, they're walking. They're getting on trains, they're walking. They're sleeping on the side of the road, they're taken into people's houses.
All the time, for a refugee, the Nazis are coming tomorrow. They're knocking on the door in 20 minutes. They're in the next town that you reach. And I think that all through his life, he always thought it could go away any minute. That whatever he had, whatever was going on, could be gone in a flash.
Although his sister Tola died on the journey, Bill made it through France, Spain, and Portugal. There he eventually boarded a ship, the Serpa Pinto, and set out for the United States.
This is a ship filled with immigrants, and here is this child who now is completely disenfranchised. He has lost his sister, his mother, his sisters, his father. He's completely alone.
We went from Lisbon by boat to Casablanca, from Casablanca to Dakar, crossed the Atlantic to Bermuda, from Bermuda to Cuba, from Cuba to New York City.
When he reached America in the fall of 1941, Bill was placed in a way station for Jewish children in Pleasantville, just north of New York City.
He's kind of offered up for adoption the way you would come to look at a pet in a pet store. Bill at this point weighs 48 pounds. He's suffering from rickets and malnutrition. This kid is a mess. He's probably not the first kid you would take into your house if you went up and looked at these kids. 6 weeks, as Bill says. 6 effing weeks. I stood by that bed and I waited while every other one of the kids who had come from Europe with me got picked.
Finally, after waiting 6 excruciating weeks, 10-year-old Bill was selected by a Bronx couple, Alfred and Pearl Ehrenreich.
Bill gave me the feeling that living in a foster home, you're not really part. You are somewhat an outsider. You kind of become a loner.
His foster care experience, especially with the Ehrenreichs, was a really positive one. He loved them dearly, but he wouldn't allow them to adopt him officially because he was always hoping somewhere, somehow, his mother would come and claim him.
It would be years before Bill would learn that his mother had died on her way to the concentration camp at Auschwitz. But for now, he would begin to acclimate himself to his new family.
He learned English so rapidly. He was completely assimilated. He was like a typical American New York kid.
He lived with the Ehrenreichs, but he never took their name. He was Billy Grajunsa. And as he says, nobody in America could spell or pronounce this name. He opened the Bronx telephone book. He went to the GR page looking for what would be closest to Grajunsa, and there were many, many Grahams. As only Bill could do, after selecting this as his name, he hated it. He hated his own name, and as he said, it's a nothing name. I hate this name.
After graduating from DeWitt Clinton High School and getting his draft orders in 1950, Graham was soon off to Korea. He returned home with a Bronze Star in 1951 and found a job in the Catskills, working as a waiter at the Concord Hotel.
Bill wasn't satisfied with making money by waiting on tables. And so he ran the poker game for the waiters.
He went into the kitchen, start taking food, and he started catering the games. But what he did was he cut $1 or more out of each pot. And this way he made himself $80, $90 for each game.
While at the Concord, Bill continued to pursue 2 of his passions, dancing and acting.
Bill was in love with Tito Puente and with Latin music, and he was a good dancer.
While Bill was at the hotel, he ran to New York every once in a while to acting classes. When he came back, he used to go through different routines that he did. And his face, well, he had like a rubber face. It was like looking at Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck put together with the frog standing on his head.
Through it all, the 23-year-old Graham still longed for the closeness of the birth family he barely knew when he fled Germany. In 1954, his prayers were answered when his older sister, Rita, reached America. A year later, Graham had a dramatic reunion with another sister, Esther, who had miraculously found Bill after surviving the Spandau concentration camp.
She tells a great story about flying to LaGuardia, and it's raining, pouring rain, and there's this guy, you know, with an umbrella. And she walks off the plane, and it's Bill. He was the only guy out there. And they didn't talk for like hours, just cried.
Esther was really a mother figure to Bill. She represented sanity, she represented stability and security.
When Rita moved to San Francisco, Bill visited frequently and was completely taken with the people and style of the West Coast. By 1963, he made San Francisco his full-time home. The young boy who escaped from the Nazis more than 2 decades earlier was about to ride to the top of a cultural phenomenon.
Did you know that Bill Graham was once described as a cross between Mother Teresa and Al Capone?
Well, the first days are the hardest days, don't you worry anymore.
Somebody once said there was maybe 4 minutes in 1965 where anything that you wished could come true. And any number of people made a wish. And over the intervening years, it did come true, you know, beyond our wildest hope.
God, what a f***ing great party it was. You got no idea. It went on for maybe from 65 to 67, and I mean, it was one great party. Ah, truly great.
While San Francisco might have been a continent away from Bill Graham's East Coast roots, in the 1960s, the city was light years away from any place on Earth. With a counterculture that was anti-war and pro-drug, Graham would struggle to find his niche until he found the San Francisco Mime Troupe, an avant-garde theater group.
When I came to the troupe, it was upstairs in a loft, and Bill Graham was the business manager. And he was the loudest, most volatile person that I'd ever met in my life.
In San Francisco in 1965, Bill Graham was a total anachronism. He couldn't have been more of an outsider. He was a New York Jew, and there weren't any.
It was during that time that Graham had his defining moment. When troop leader Ronnie Davis was arrested in 1965 for performing illegally in Lafayette Park, Graham organized a benefit to pay for Davis's legal expenses. At the ad hoc event, Graham turned to a newly formed local band named Jefferson Airplane to be among the headliners. It was his first stroke of genius in a career that would be filled with many of them.
They were actually lined up around several blocks to get into that benefit. And when that happened, Bill Graham's eyes rolled back in his head and he saw Nirvana.
It's not that he's seen kids standing in line willing to pay money to get in. He's seen that. He has seen total strangers dance with each other on the floor and then move off and never speak. He has seen the magic that was going on at that point in San Francisco. To him, this is real theater.
5 weeks later, Graham was back in the concert promotion business, but this time he wanted a larger venue and a bigger buzz. His search would lead to the Fillmore Auditorium, which in time would become synonymous with Graham himself. But getting the Fillmore came with a price.
Bill affects a relationship with a black man named Charles Sullivan, who held the lease on the Fillmore and had promoted basically black acts there for years. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and as only Bill could, he got Charles to let him put on some shows.
Jefferson Airplane, John Handy, Quintet, and Sam Thomas, and Mystery Trend, and the Great Society are all playing at Fillmore Auditorium Friday, December 10th, and I would like to go if I could.
We made so much money that the mime troupe was trying to consider whether or not we should do this as an adjunct to keep us afloat. And while we were all doing that, Bill ran out and signed the lease himself for the Fillmore and started his new career.
The performers and staff of the mime troupe thought he had totally hijacked everything that we've been trying to do.
By the end of the year, he's out of the mime troupe. And in January, he's renting the hall for $60 a night from Charles Sullivan. And he's on his own. No more benefits. Profits all to Bill.
In no time, Graham was addicted to the money that came from promoting concerts. But he soon realized that there was some formidable competition on the San Francisco music scene. Chet Helms and the Family Dog Enterprise had begun to stage similar gatherings in the area. Having already abandoned the mime troupe, it didn't take long for Graham to squeeze out the less sophisticated Helms.
Chet was doing a lot of valuable stuff. Chet was booking psychedelic bands. Chet had a better ear for the music than Bill ever did. Chet was part of the music generation.
He was a hippie, and Bill ate him up and spit him out, basically. He just overpowered Chet.
Helms and Graham had reached an agreement to produce shows on alternate weekends at the Fillmore. But the deal quickly fell apart around the booking of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band in March 1966. After the band wowed the Fillmore audiences, Helms quickly learned how cutthroat Graham could be.
Bill got up at 6 in the morning and called New York and got Albert Grossman's office on the phone, knowing that Grossman was the manager, and booked the act for himself for the Fillmore and cut Chet out. He thought it was a story of great ambition and how life rewards the ambitious. Chet will tell you that it's a story of how a partner betrays someone.
I think I went to bed having every right to believe that a gentleman that I had a fiduciary and partnership relationship with wouldn't screw me. But if you think it's smart and clever to screw somebody that you have a partnership relationship with, I don't know. I guess that's okay if those are your ethics, but they're not mine.
Helms reluctantly moved his shows to another venue in San Francisco, leaving the 34-year-old Graham with the freedom to exploit a society waiting to explode.
All of these disparate people, for some reason, gathering together in this small city in Northern California at the very edge of Western civilization, as it were, at this period of time in the middle of the 20th century. Why it occurred, and you don't know any more than why Paris occurred in the 20s or New York occurred in the 30s, but it did.
We knew that San Francisco was taking it to a new level that straight America was hungry for, which was a different kind of latitude.
People were leaving home. They weren't just tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. They were leaving mommy and daddy and arriving at Haight Street with a blanket around their shoulders. They wanted to have access to the culture of the time, and they wanted to be able to do it in an environment of people like themselves.
At the Fillmore, every one of Graham's paying guests was given a free red apple. It became one of his signature trademarks, although his audience might have preferred LSD or marijuana. In an environment where the drug scene was the scene, to many making money was mainstream and unimportant. Bill often straddled the line between socialist and capitalist, an awkward position he found himself in when he organized Ken Kesey's Trips Festival, where dropping acid was more important than raising money.
You have 5,000 people high on LSD running around Longshoremen's Hall, and all manner of pretty much benign craziness happening. And there's Bill Graham in a cardigan sweater with carrying a clipboard trying to keep a schedule.
He was shocked by Kesey. He was shocked by the acid trips. He didn't like to see people out of control, but he understood what made a concert work. And part of the scene back then was people getting high in the audience.
But you need that middle ground to be accountable to pay the rent for the building and pay the musicians. I mean, you can't just like, here's a kilo, man, and thanks for playing. It's like, what?
One example of Graham's genius in capitalizing on the scene was the development of the concert poster. Bill hired local artists and gave them an open canvas. In return, he got posters that were psychedelic, provocative, and mind-bending, enduring symbols of the times.
The product they were producing somehow gave us a credibility, an artistic credibility that ordinary musical shows didn't have.
The artists were given a great deal of freedom to do pretty much what they wanted to do. And it was the freedom we had that really allowed us to do all these different things. All the artists that made them were trying to replicate visually what we were doing sonically. And so it was a beautiful dance that we were doing with the artists. And it was now. It was in the moment. And that's what made it so special, was they were just jamming it out within hours. They weren't sitting there for weeks or days. It was like, bang, hit the street.
The posters needed to be wild and colorful if they were going to match the wide array of bands that Graham would assemble for each show.
bands gave him this huge long list of names, starting with B.B. King and Otis Redding on down to Russian poets and Ravi Shankar's, these very disparate shows of artists who were totally unrelated to one another.
No white man had ever flown cross-country to say to Otis, come play for me. Miles Davis understood Bill, too. Nobody had ever come to Miles and say, listen, I know you think these kids are difficult, they're weird, they're not your generation. Come play for me.
He said, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody was quiet. You could hear a pin fall. He said, I bring you the chairman of the board, B.B. King. And everybody stood up. I'd never had that happen to me before, never. So when they stood up, I cried because I was so overwhelmed.
We'd have shows, you know, the Dead, us, Quicksilver, Santana, all on the same bill. I mean, it was, then they'd all get together at the end and play together. You know, when we go on into the morning hours sometimes, you know, like 4 or 5 bass players, 6 guitar players, 3 drummers, all on stage just jamming. Guys singing, making up lyrics. That was fantastic.
What Graham created inside the Fillmore was also fantastic. To Bill, the concert experience was more than just music, so he invented an entirely new landscape of sight and sound.
Anything could be happening, but the primary thing was to come into this place and be surrounded by the sensations of the lights and the sounds, light shows.
It's a very small, very low stage, and this light show just enveloped the whole end of the hall, and the stage was just sort of in the center and the bottom of the light show. Flashing, pulsing colors just filled the whole room.
Everybody was tripping, and you needed something to look at, and we weren't real pretty, and there was no real lights on the stage. I mean, you didn't even know what we looked like. I mean, Jerry and I would walk to the back of the Fillmore, get off the stage, you know, we just stopped playing. We'd walk and get a Coke in the audience, and then walk back on the stage and start playing.
By 1967, Bill Graham was directly in the middle of the West Coast music scene. The Fillmore was packing in crowds on a nightly basis, and the bands Bill presented were picking up a national following. Part promoter, part capitalist, Graham set his sights on the bands, hoping to gain an even bigger piece of the pie.
Biography's look at Bill Graham will continue, but first, Biography celebrates its 1,000th episode. Visit biography.com and take a virtual tour of the Biography studio and find out some fun facts you might not know about the show.
In the mid-1960s, there was little debate that Bill Graham was emerging as the most powerful promoter in rock and roll. Still, he wanted more. Over time, Graham began to expand his empire into a new field, band management. It would not be an easy road, and Bill would soon find out there was an enormous difference between providing a stage for a band and managing its career.
Leaders of the opposition, Jefferson Airplane.
The first band Graham managed was Jefferson Airplane, a group he had first promoted at the original Mime Troupe benefit. Before Grace Slick joined the band in the fall of 1966, the Airplane was already successful on the West Coast. Now it was ready to explode on the national scene.
I think that had to have really affected him because Grace was a good, strong personality.
It was a magical experience with her, it really was from the beginning, and I think Bill saw clay that he could mold.
There was a mutual respect as well as a mutual antagonism. You're almost an adversary trying to get our particular mentalities into his business world and him inserting his Bill Graham world into our mentalities. There was always this clash.
While he was managing them, they had the 2 top 10 records of their career, White Rabbit and Somebody to Love. That was the summer of '67. And he decided to send those guys anywhere he could route them.
Well, he wanted us to work too much and be rock stars. We had a sort of a conflict with him in the sense that we wanted to stay home in San Francisco rather than be out in Cleveland, you know, or Duluth.
Yeah, we were missing all the fun. I'd much rather write about the revolution I believe in, which is living. And I find, you know, being home in Frisco really makes me feel like I want to write again, or I want to sing.
They were just tired of this father, teacher figure, authority figure over them at all times.
Our drummer at the time, who was living with Grace, chose to exercise an authority he shouldn't have exercised, and got Grace to agree, to her discredit, that unless we fired Bill, that she would quit the band with him. And we made the unfortunate choice of going along with that.
You know, I've always said that was like firing Godzilla. And he'd call me up at all times, day or night, say, buddy, don't ever get a Jewish kid in the gutter. I go, Bill, I'm just a hippie living in the Haight-Ashbury, you know.
From San Francisco, this is Santana.
Burned by the airplane, Graham turned his attention to a young guitarist he had met at the Fillmore, Carlos Santana.
So a friend of mine walked up to Bill Graham and he said, "Hey, Bill, I have a friend from Tijuana, you know, this Mexican kid who he likes BB a lot. You know, do you think you let him play?" And I did my thing, and when I finished, Bill Graham said, "Hey, that was pretty good, man. You got a band?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "How would you like to open up for the Loading Zone and the Who?"
I first saw Santana at the Fillmore Auditorium, and it sounded like a warmed-over version of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. You wondered why they were there, other than the fact that they were from San Francisco.
We played Mary Poppins here, you know, Shin Shim Cherie, but with congas. Pretty much like and Bill's ears were like, "Oh, this is different," and he started seeing how people reacted to it. And next thing I know, he's saying, "Listen, you guys need to work on some songs because everything sounds like a jam." I go, "Songs? What do you mean?" He says, "You know, a chorus, a bridge, a verse, things like that." I go, "What's that?" Then he introduced us to Willie Bobo, the music of Willie Bobo, which is like Evil Ways. And that was our first single.
Bill brought the New York salsa mentality and sensibility to Carlos Santana and to the Santana Blues Band.
3 conga players, timbales, percussion, 2 guitars. Man, they were wild.
Carlos, he loved, I would say, almost as his son. And I think Carlos loved him almost as his second dad.
But the mutual affection that Bill and Carlos had for one another failed to come through on the business end of the relationship.
He had some kind of a weird thing go down with Santana where he was handling them and they didn't have a contract, and then Santana went their separate ways. But see, with us, he had a contract. And he would say, "What happened with me with Santana, it's never going to happen again."
Bill Graham could never manage anybody. He needed a manager. You know, he needed to be managed. He was an artist.
Your friends and mine, the Grateful Dead.
Graham would face similar problems with another band, the free-spirited Bay Area icons, the Grateful Dead, and its mercurial leader, Jerry Garcia.
Bill comes over, you know, here he comes, he puts his clipboard down, he gets down by my guitar, he starts fumbling around with the pieces, you know, trying to fix it. And right then, it's like, you know, my heart went out to him right then.
And he loved Bill for the next 30 years out of that one little moment.
She's got everything delightful. She's got everything I need.
You know, Grateful Dead, we were just giving it away, and they were taking our instruments back, and Bill said, you know, you can give it away, but, you know, you also have to pay the rent.
Bill's definitive comment on the Dead was they aren't the best at what they do, they're the only ones at what they do. They were a mess, and they were a glorious, wonderful mess, but Bill was a disciplined, defined, productive person. It's different from the Grateful Dead entirely.
He was saying, "Mickey, when you're 25, are you going to be doing this?" He would stand there on the stage. I said, "Yeah, Bill, I think I might do this for the rest of my life." He said, "But there are no songs. You can't hum any of the songs." It's okay, Bill. This is real music. You don't have to hum the song, but to get it, you know. He said, "But you guys will never be successful. You don't have any songs, Mickey."
As Garcia once said, Bill was the straight guy that, you know, was the interface, a noun, not a verb, between the Grateful Dead's complete insanity and the real world's, whatever that real world consists of.
We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. That's not what we want. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to hurt anybody. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life.
We wanted him to take us to Egypt. And we had big placards that say, Egypt or bust, or PA's a must. We wanted him to buy us a PA that day. And he stayed up, we talked to him till dawn. Then he called up our manager and said, oh, they're well-meaning, but they're crazy, man. There's a war going on over there. Picked up the phone, I said, okay, Bill, you, you, Bill, you, Bill, you, Bill, you, Bill, we'll do it ourselves. And I hung up on him. We went to Egypt, and of course he wanted to come then. So he came as our guest.
Bill's relationship with the Dead was more a mutual admiration society than a management deal, and it would ultimately prove to be an exercise in business futility and frustration. But through all the ups and downs, Bill remained the band's biggest fan. He was the first real Deadhead and promoted dozens of the band's shows in the Bay Area well into the 1980s.
He might be as responsible as any one person for creating the cult-like following they had.
It was in the early 80s, Bill noticed that there were a lot of kids that were the same kids right in front of the stage every night. So he asked me, he said, are there kids following this thing around? I said, yeah, they show up outside the night before.
What have you been doing out here all this time?
Oh, I don't know. We sleep out here at night and we go different places during the day and have a couple people stay in line and keep our places.
Are you a Deadhead?
I would say so.
And he goes, well, let's start taking care of them. Let's talk to the buildings. Let's put some toilets out there for them. Let's see if we can get the parking lots opened up early and provide water and garbage pickup. And let's create a little scene outside these shows. Take care of these fans.
For the Grateful Dead, it was all part of a long, strange trip that Graham would come face to face with one evening.
I think Jerry and I were standing backstage, and I had a cup full of acid and a Coke, and Jerry and I were sharing it, and all of a sudden Bill ran by with his clipboard. He just grabbed it out of my hand, and he took a big sip. And I looked at him and I said, Bill, the road you travel now will not be a familiar one. He just looked at me and he kept going. And about 25 minutes later, the clipboard was down, and he was just standing there with a beatific smile on his face. He grabbed the cowbell, and he started playing the cowbell along with me, and started whacking the gong during a ballad song. And I said, Bill, this is a ballad song, Bill, Bill. And he just looked like that, and he just was playing, and he was just gone. He was just in another zone.
Professionally, Graham was in another zone as well. Having conquered and revolutionized the West Coast live club music scene, he now set his sights on doing the same back east. By 1968, Bill Graham and his burgeoning empire was bursting at the seams, and the intimate Fillmore Auditorium was far too small for someone who thought so big.
He would be selling tickets at the back door, Bill himself, bringing people in here. We had 3,700 people paid for an airplane show. You couldn't move. You really couldn't move.
Capitalizing on his success, Graham took over the slightly larger Carousel Ballroom in 1968 and renamed it the Fillmore West. At the same time, Bill was also using an abandoned ice arena for his expanding weekend shows, the 5,400-seat Winterland.
What was happening was the music was becoming more popular, and for Bill to keep up with it, he had to run a business. You know, why do 1,200 people on a Friday night when you could do 5,400?
He'd have the Fillmore shows on Thursday, and then Friday and Saturday would be Winterland, and they'd come back on Sunday. The bills would have 3 bands on them, and the bands would play sequentially opening act, middle act, headliner, and then opening act, middle act, headliner, which created an interesting situation in that every opening act had a primetime slot at the show, right after the headliner's first set. And I can remember Albert King murdering Jimi Hendrix in that slot.
With everything working in San Francisco, Graham was about to make a bold move. If anyone was going to bridge the cultural gap between the West Coast and the East Coast, it would be Bill Graham.
San Francisco was small. San Francisco was easy. Bill was a huge star in San Francisco. Everything was good. He was the king of the world. I think he was positioned into coming back to New York.
Bill got the sense that it could happen in New York through a series of business maneuvers, and with some partners in New York, acquired the Lowe's Commodore Theater at 6th Street and 2nd Avenue, and that became the Fillmore East.
Bill had picked one of the best places in New York City, down on the Lower East Side, Lower Village, East Village, really hip, intellectual. San Francisco was more into tripping out and into the feeling, into the body. San Francisco was into the body, the emotions of the body, whereas New York City was into the mind.
On March 8, 1968, the Fillmore East opened. The headliner was Big Brother and the Holding Company, and its star, the legendary Janis Joplin.
It was total pandemonium on opening night. We were hit by the New York crush. It was exhilarating, it was scary. I remember seeing people seriously crushed up against the walls.
You could sit up in the mezzanine on the balcony of the Fillmore East. It was like wearing headphones. It was amazing. Some of the best sound you ever saw. But the physical setup of the building channeled the energy.
Well, you know you got it if it makes you feel good. Oh, yes, it did.
There was no time factors there. We could play as long as we could stand up. And Bill encouraged that, and that became legendary. It wasn't like just going to a show for an hour, 2 or 3. You know, you'd go and have an experience for 8 hours or 12 hours.
Fillmore East being a landmark almost immediately, I think a lot of artists were driven to perform even better than usual under the always watchful eye of Bill Graham.
While rock legends such as Jimi Hendrix and The Who played to capacity crowds, the Fillmore East also provided a venue for a whole new roster of acts, including the Jay Giles Band and the Allman Brothers.
The Allman Brothers, the first time the Allman Brothers showed up, nobody was expecting anything. There were just these, rednecks from Georgia who drove up in a truck.
In all my life, I've never heard the kind of music that this group plays, the finest contemporary music. We're going to round it off with the best of them all, the Allman Brothers.
The times that we played at the Fillmore East were probably the biggest strides that the Allman Brothers made in their early days. Man, we played there so many times, I started feeling like the house band,
Bill loved presenting them. Bill loved hanging out with them. Bill loved talking to them and about them. They felt and still feel like he was a real member of the family.
A lot of people don't believe in a whole lot of stuff like this, but in theaters and places like that, spirits hoover to get a chance to do what they do, to frolic.
Hover. Hoover was the president. They hover.
You're sitting on that stage, and it's like you don't have any choice but to do anything but to play, because all that energy is there.
The only place they would do 2 shows a night, and if Bill asked them, they probably would have done 3.
As he had done in San Francisco, Bill took risks, both artistically and financially. He was driven to enhance the musical experience, and in New York, he did it by hiring the Joshua Light Show.
The Joshua Light Show in New York was the epitome of what light shows should be like. I mean, it was brilliant, it was creative. There's never been anything like it.
There was the direct projection of images. There were mirrored effects in which images were broken up and put back together again with mirrors. Plus, there were traditional films and slides and a lot of color, and everything changed all the time.
It was a real ensemble of 6 visual artists performing visual music on an ad hoc and ad-lib basis. 3 sets, 2 shows a night. It was mind-blowing.
We made a picture of Richard Nixon with his eyes crossed. All we had to do was put that up on the screen, and we always got a laugh. People have been coming up to me my whole life and telling me they saw God in the middle of that white dot, in the middle of the screen, in the 3rd hour of this Dead concert in April of 1969. And I know that it was just a white dot, but it was a really good white dot.
Bill Graham had successfully transferred the West Coast experience to New York. In the late 1960s, the rock world revolved around Graham's Fillmores. It was hard to imagine, but within 3 years, both buildings would see their last show.
You are watching Bill Graham on Biography.
By early 1969, Bill Graham was running an expanding empire with Fillmore's on both coasts. But at the age of 38, he was also running down.
He had so many irons in the fire, you know. I just wondered, sometimes I wonder how the hell he keeps up with all this stuff.
Bill started an agency, a management company, the beginnings of a merchandising company, and that was only in New York.
He had been producing probably on average 2 shows a night in 2 different cities, coast to coast. So how much can you do before you get wiped out?
His private life took an awful toll. His family life took an awful toll.
Bill's marriage to the former Bonnie McLean, who had been with him since before the days of the mine troupe, was now disintegrating. It was a nasty situation and would eventually lead to a custody battle for his infant son, David.
I sat literally next to him when his son was born. We were in New York. His wife was giving birth in San Francisco.
First time Bill sees his own son, they project a picture of David in the light show on Fillmore East. I think that says a lot about what his family life was like.
Well, it meant that he was away a lot. And then, of course, it meant the end of our marriage because being away, he strayed. And it caused great problems for us and eventually the end of the relationship.
With his personal life in turmoil, Bill was also in a fight to keep his relatively small venues thriving on opposite coasts. The rock and roll experience was changing right before his eyes, and Graham was about to get overrun. In 1969, Graham was incensed when Michael Lang organized the Woodstock Festival. Far from an intimate experience, Bill saw Woodstock as an over-commercialized ripoff, a misuse of the relationship between the music and the audience.
I don't think Bill ever really got what Woodstock was about. At one point when he became aware of, you know, the size and the scope of it, I think he got a little nervous about it.
You realize that half of these people don't have tickets. There are people 5 miles away sitting on a highway with tickets who've driven 2,000 or 3,000 miles. Whatever has to be done to make it right, this is wrong.
Now serious business was looking at the box office and realizing that if 400,000 people will show up, you can make money. And after Woodstock, which Bill didn't like, but it was a big hit, he couldn't do anything about it, there was this thing 7 months later called Altamont. Altamont was one day and people died.
Graham felt that Altamont, with the Rolling Stones performing and the Hells Angels providing security, was nothing more than an uncontrollable mob of people in horrible and unsafe conditions where quality no longer mattered. It was the worst that music had to offer. In Graham's world, the large extravaganza also represented a fundamental business problem. As the artists and their agents gained more control, playing small clubs on Graham's terms were no longer part of the plan.
After Woodstock, the managers and the bands start to take control. They are stars, they can make demands, they don't necessarily want to play the Fillmore East, we'd rather play Madison Square Garden, Bill.
I even say it just like the power. You managers, the artists, and it's the managers that really have the power.
The promoter is at the mercy of the power source. Act, manager, agent.
All of a sudden, you weren't able to package our own shows. I mean, a headliner would come in and their agent would tell us who was going to play with them, you know? And this was totally against everything we did here.
His idol, Saul Urach, a great promoter of ballet and opera, has been given a chance to book the Metropolitan Opera House for a couple weeks. And Bill wants to bring the band, a wonderful band, in there.
So he basically offered the band half of what it normally get for the prestige of playing in a hall that had bad acoustics. I didn't see what, you know, the big favor he was doing us, and I said so to him. And he completely freaked out. How dare I be so ungrateful?
Now basically Bill is so burnt out, he's so completely crazed by the way he's been living. This is the final straw.
He called us in for a meeting and started telling us how nobody appreciates him. He's tired of fighting with the artists, and the managers, and City Hall, and the police, and no more. I'm closing down this facility. I'm not doing this anymore.
Fillmore East did not have to close, did not have to wrap it up. God only knows why he did. I can't, to this day, fathom.
There was never been any discussion. There had never been anything in the wind. No one had a clue. It just fell on you like a ton of bricks.
It's been mainly pleasure and having a good time for me and earning a good living. And that which I have to put into it now no longer gives me that.
Graham would book his last show at the Fillmore East on the final weekend of June in 1971.
He invited every band that ever played at the Fillmore to show up and play. We came back out for the encore, say 3 or 4 in the morning, started playing a jam, and ended at about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. When we finished playing, there was no applause, not even one person, you know, just complete silence. Somebody got up, walked over and opened the doors, and the sun came pouring in, and everybody, this is a New York audience, just got up and started quietly filing out, you know, and I remember just sitting there stunned, you know, after about 6 or 7 hours of playing, could hardly move, and I remember Dwayne walking in front of me, dragging his guitar behind him, going, God damn, it's like leaving church.
Just 1 week later, the Fillmore West would also shut its doors. Despite losing his 2 musical jewels, Graham didn't lose his desire to produce shows. He continued to make his mark at Winterland and even booked the band for its farewell concert, a Martin Scorsese filmed event titled The Last Waltz. Dinner for 5,400 people was served before the show. A lavish set from the opera La Traviata served as the backdrop. And Muddy Waters, Neil Diamond, Van Morrison, and Bob Dylan were among the guests on stage.
Waltz was about all of us pulling together creatively while Scorsese was having a film end going.
Bob spontaneously, after his last song, went into a new song called Baby Let Me Follow You Down, which was one of the earliest songs he ever had done. And Bob's road manager was at the corner of the stage and said, this is not on the list. This is not on the list. You can't shoot this. And Bill grabbed him by the neck and said, sit down, mother. They're going to shoot it, and just threw him off the stage. So that was Bill, you know? He knew it was too important.
But almost nothing Bill did could compare with Winterland's wildest night, the traditional New Year's Eve concert with the Grateful Dead.
Bill was afraid of heights, and yet on every Grateful Dead show, he would fly in as Father Time on various structures that we would build and fly over the audience until he landed on stage at midnight.
One time he came in and it was at 12:20 because he had another show across town. He said, New Year's is when I say it is. I said, Bill, it's like almost 12:30. He said, New Year's is when I say it is. He goes, count it down. 10, 9, and so we had New Year's a couple of times like at 12:30.
And to see Father Time, you know, descending out of the sky in one thing or another was an absolutely unbelievable experience. Everybody was so ecstatic and so into it and so unified in the mission of joy. It was like, yeah.
Biography will continue in a moment on A&E.
Just 20 calories.
From 1966 to 1974, there's just a world of difference. The money's going up geometrically, the staffs are going up geometrically, everything's just exploded. Bill became grander, more ambitious, more self-centered, more, you know, the P.T. Barnum of rock.
Having now promoted shows for nearly a decade, Bill Graham saw the concert scene changing by the mid-1970s. He also realized that in order to survive, he would have to change with it. Ever the survivor, Graham was about to put his stamp on another genre, stadium rock. And just like he did at the Fillmores, Bill would embrace the new world on his terms.
He went from, I don't want to do this anymore, to, I'm going to do stadiums. It's like, oh, now we know he's mad. But he did do stadiums, and he did them better than anybody else.
In the mid-'70s, Graham went on to produce national tours for Bob Dylan, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and George Harrison. But his main event was an outdoor gathering in Oakland.
He comes up with the concept of Day on the Green. Now what this is it's the rock festival from the 60s put into a single-day frame where you see 3 or 4 really good bands. You're not sitting in the mud, the toilets are clean. Bill takes the rock festival concept and he shrinks it and he makes it something viable.
Thank you very, very much for waiting. Would you welcome, please, a good friend, Mr. Peter Frampton.
As he did with the Fillmore, Graham also changed the artistic landscape of outdoor concerts.
Bill did create sets that were thematic for his Days on the Greens. You'd come into the stadium and you'd have something visual to look at. It would feel like an event. It was just the introduction of theater.
Shadows grow so long from my eyes, and then
Bill would say he would much rather someone said, I went to a Bill Graham Presents concert than a Bill Graham concert. And what he was really saying was, he built a business. That's a big deal to him.
As Bill always said, we weren't in show business, we were in the business of public assembly. Almost everyone who worked for the company was hired by Bill. And they were hired because in them he saw a certain aspect of himself.
BGP was like the rock and roll special forces, you know, and their mission was to create the greatest rock and roll experience possible.
You never felt like you were working for somebody. You were working with somebody. It wasn't really a job. It was about getting the job done, but there were no titles, there was no hierarchy.
Graham was fiercely loyal. If someone on his team was affected, it affected him. At a 1977 Day on the Green concert, a fight broke out between Led Zeppelin manager Peter Grant and one of Graham's security guards, Jim Mazurkis.
Well, he was outraged that these people could treat someone that worked for him that way, to the point where he actually took Jim back in to get apologized to.
A couple of security guards came in to the trailer and they physically removed Bill. I was basically in a defense mode where I was trying to protect myself and my body.
He'd lost teeth. His face was black and blue everywhere. He was bleeding from his head, from his face. I mean, they had pummeled him.
One of them reached down and was trying to rip my eyeball out of the socket.
The only thing to do was to look at what had happened and call it what it was and have them arrested. The entourage of police walked into the Hilton Hotel on Monday morning, past all their security, and they didn't, once they saw the cops there, they really didn't resist.
2 days later, 4 members of the Zeppelin entourage, including drummer John Bonham, were arrested. After that, Zeppelin never again played an American tour date. The door was then opened for Graham to improve his relationship with Great Britain's other legendary rock band, the Rolling Stones. Bill and the Stones had run hot and cold since Graham first booked them for 3 shows in California in 1969.
Is it the guy who thinks he's bigger than the stars that he's putting on the stage? You know, it's Bill Graham. This is a picture in the dressing room of him giving the bird, and he's laid out a lovely spread of food, and you're not in the mood, and I ended up flinging the food at the picture.
3 years later, they've come to recognize that if you want to work in America, you don't do what they did at Altamont. You don't hire the Hells Angels to be security. You got to deal with Bill Graham, because Bill Graham knows how to do this, and Bill puts on all these shows for them in '72.
I realized I was dealing with a creative person and not some flash, egotistical businessman. He was an artist, and he did have an ego at least as large as mine, even not bigger than Jagger's, and that's saying something.
Graham eventually capitalized on that relationship when the Stones let him produce their extravagant 1981 U.S. tour.
They were the greatest rock and roll band in the world, and he was the greatest rock promoter in the world, so of course he wanted a match there.
Jagger, who was clearly the business part of this situation, he wanted Bill to understand that if he got this tour, it was the Rolling Stones. It wasn't Bill Graham presents the Rolling Stones.
Bill got to deal with Mick and me. Now, anybody that wants to get between these two, there's gravestones, you know, that go down the road behind the Rolling Stones of people who put themselves in that position and couldn't handle it.
There's something about Keith's kind of street animal quality that I think Bill related to.
You could fight with Bill. You could yell at him. You could, you know, cry on your shoulder, or vice versa. You could human, you know, contact. It was not just business.
Nobody had double stadium tours before. Nobody had gone and done, you know, multiple stadiums and on this level. And it was an opportunity for my dad to really show what he could do.
They deliver. I mean, I think that's, in the end, you know, all the hoopla and all the ballyhoo. You watch the audience, and you see the response in every town. And if that isn't positive power, then what is?
No, it was the first time, as far as I know, where anybody used one of those big lifts and swung the artist out over the audience.
It was something to watch Bill. He was tasting his passion. He was seeing his passion. He was feeling his passion. He was smelling the crowds. The roar of the grease paint, the smell of the crowds.
Biography's look at Bill Graham will continue, but first, Biography celebrates its 1,000th episode. Visit biography.com and take a virtual tour of the Biography studio and find out some fun facts you might not know about the show.
By the mid-1980s, Bill Graham was once again the king of concert promotion. His empire was far-reaching. With businesses that ranged from record companies to t-shirts to catering, Graham was turning music into money, and while the profits rolled in, it really reflected on Bill's personality.
Bill had a lot of money, and he had some very expensive Armani suits. I mean, he could really deck out and look like $1,000,000, but his favorite things were comfortable old things that for whatever reason he loved. He had a blue and white striped sweater thing with a hood on it that just had holes all over it, and he only stopped wearing it because we finally took it away from him.
Bill never bought a new car. He bought every car as a used car. He wasn't about material possessions.
Bill's most noteworthy possession was his Northern California home, which he called Masada.
Bill loved Masada because he was always there by himself. And on every level, it was a fortress. And the real Masada is where the Jews killed themselves rather than surrendering to the Romans.
The more lasting memories I have of him are reading the paper at the kitchen table in the morning, cutting out clippings, you know, eating a little food, making us an omelet. And he just felt totally comfortable there.
Bill did the best he could to be a good dad. He didn't have a dad. He didn't have a family, really. I don't think he knew how to be a dad particularly, but he did the best he could.
But finding someone to share that home with him on a consistent basis would prove to be a haunting problem.
He had more trouble with women than any man I knew. I mean, he was an attractive man to women. He really was, because of his money and his success. And you'd go over there, and he had more women than you could shake a stick at.
His married life and his love life were always really rocky because his first love was his business.
I always felt like he was such a man, and I was hearing this side of a little kid who was going through some changes that most of us go when you're in junior high school on an emotional level. You know what I mean? So it was like, wow, this is really different. You know, I thought this cat had it so together as a man, but he's so dysfunctional on this other emotional, practical level.
In the mid-1970s, Bill had met Marcia Salt, and together they had a son, Alex, in 1977. But when Bill and Marcia split, Graham's relationship with his son never really got off the ground.
He and my mom actually separated before I was born. So I never saw my mother and my father as a couple, I guess you could say.
He just didn't know how to make Alex feel comfortable, and and there was something wrong there, and Alex, for his entire life, I think he lacked a lot of attention that he deserved.
He would see parts of himself in me, and I think a lot of them reminded him of parts of his life maybe that he had chosen to block out, or maybe didn't remember, or even parts of him that were unresolved.
On the outside, Graham seemed to handle the ups and downs of a life in rock and roll, but inside, he was a mess.
He came up to my office and he closed the door and he said, "I'm 50 today." He said, "I looked in the mirror this morning. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know who I was seeing. I can't sleep. I can't fall in love. I'm lonely all the time."
In 1982, at the age of 51, Graham began a personal relationship with his professional assistant, Jan Simmons. They had been together in Europe producing the Rolling Stones tour. For the moment, Bill's search for romantic happiness appeared to be over.
Jan and Bill almost were married. Actually, we agreed to play at their wedding.
He liked to call me Jan Simmons. He would say, not just Jan, he said, "Jan Simmons, if I ask you to marry me, would you?" And I thought he could be very silly, and I thought he was goofing. And so I said, "Well, there's only one way to find out." And I was flabbergasted when he stood me up and put his hands on my shoulders face to face and said, "Will you marry me?" And you could have knocked me over with a feather.
You should have seen the ring. Oh my God, it was gorgeous. Diamonds and emeralds, and she was so happy. How could you tell her it was never going to happen?
I said to him, we should start pinning down a date so I can have my relatives start making some travel plans. And he was in pain. I knew something was weird, because I think he really wanted to go through with it, but he couldn't.
Jan did one of the all-time great canceled future spouse moves. It was at our Christmas party, and she came out in a wedding dress and sang Wedding Bell Blues, you know, to Bill in front of our whole company.
He hadn't been being faithful to me. He was never faithful to any woman, I don't think. And God bless him, I don't think he could be. I don't think he ever really believed that anything was really his. He always had to hedge. He had to have something else.
Bill lost his mother. He lost Tola, the older sister who was supposed to protect him. He was basically abandoned by every woman that he loved when he was a child. I don't think it's hard to understand why he had problems being with one woman at one time as an adult.
At the same time he was seeing Simmons, Graham renewed a relationship with another one of his assistants, Regina Cartwright.
Regina was beautiful. Regina was brilliant, bright, literate. Regina exuded sex. In fact, she was sex.
I remember talking to him once about Regina, and his remark to me was, "I would rather just touch her than be with anyone else."
There was no integration between Regina and anybody else. I was probably one of the only people who talked to her.
Graham's fragile personal life and chaotic relationships were in direct contrast to the joy he brought to so many others. And while he had trouble maintaining any personal balance in his life, Graham was always the first to help, often with tough love when a friend was in need. In the case of Johnny Podell, it was a cocaine habit.
You know anything about interventions? The format is everybody speaks and everybody says how they know me, how much they love me, what I've meant to them. So I think 8 of my best friends already, I had mentally seen them rip up my Rolodex cards, and now it came to Bill. He said, "You know, Johnny, we've never lied to each other. It's been the basis of our relationship. Honesty. But if you can't admit you're in trouble now, and you won't accept what everybody's telling you have to, we're over. Don't call me." I heard that. That was the clanging of the jailhouse door behind you. And I was in a rehab the next day. Years later, I said, "So why did you speak at the end?" And he looked up, smiled, and said, "Because I know how to close."
From Boston, their 10th anniversary, one of the great rock and roll bands, the Girls Band.
Despite all the success Bill Graham had in the music world, he would always carry the burden of his escape from the Holocaust as a child. In 1985, Graham would again be reminded of his darkest days when President Reagan visited Germany's Bitburg Cemetery, the final resting place for many of Hitler's elite SS troops.
The fact that the President of the United States could have been as calloused to Bill's background and to Bill's personal experience as a Holocaust orphan was something he couldn't comprehend. And so he rolled up his sleeves and he started doing everything he could.
all they have to do is say, we made a mistake. Don't cover up Bitburg, just don't go to Bitburg.
In an effort to further educate the public, Graham paid for a full-page ad in the San Francisco Chronicle and staged a protest in Union Square before leaving on a European vacation.
And he kept calling, and the phone didn't get answered. Finally, the answering service picked up, and the woman said, Bill Graham burned down today. Not Bill Graham Presents burned down, Bill Graham burned down.
You're in business 20 years, and this happens the day after Mr. Reagan's visit to Bitburg. I don't think there's any doubt as to what the connection is.
We were salvaging his archives, his life. There really wasn't much left of the rest of the office. It was all completely gutted. When he found out that we still had his dance hall keeper's permit and he showed it to us, he said, now I know I'm still in business.
In many respects, Graham never fully recovered from the tragedy. Bitterly hurt, he turned his focus to benefits, helping causes that varied from AIDS awareness and drug prevention to earthquake relief and the freeing of Nelson Mandela.
He said something to me one time that really made a lot of sense, and that's that how can you help anybody unless you have some power to help them with?
I get sick and tired of people saying, oh, the world is terrible, the streets are dirty, there are too many drugs, the wars. What else do you do? Do you kvetch? What else do you do?
It became, how can I top myself? Oh, is this the hardest thing anybody's ever tried to do? Good, I'm interested.
Like the challenge Graham faced in helping put together Live Aid in the summer of 1985, the two-continent concert for hunger relief.
What he did was bring 43 bands and have them perform on one stage on one day.
In 1987, Graham brought Stadium Rock to the Soviet Union for the first time at a Moscow peace concert, and was involved in Amnesty International's concerts to promote human rights in 1986 and 1988.
The Amnesty International tour, Conspiracy of Hope, was a kind of a triumph, actually. It really did raise a lot of money. The international tour for Amnesty International was a very bitter experience for Bill. He wasn't in control. His state of mind was so bad at that point, I think that it would have been hard for him to do anything and feel good about it.
Graham looked for control back home in San Francisco. Instead of paying to repair its rundown condition, Bill closed Winterland in 1978, and soon after set out searching for a new venue to promote his concerts. Unable to find one suitable for his needs, Graham decided to build his own. The Shoreline Amphitheater in nearby Mountain View would become Bill Graham Presents' centerpiece. With Shoreline, Bill would be able to control every element of presenting a concert and continue to be the major force in Bay Area concert promotion.
Most of his net worth went into the development of Shoreline. Shoreline was designed to be much bigger than any other place in the Bay Area because we wanted the groups to know if you don't work for Bill, you don't have to work for Bill, but you're sure going to make a lot less money if you don't.
If you look at the music business, the word business is certainly an important part of it. And I can only speak for myself, and probably Jack in some way. We like to make money. And Bill liked to make money, too. And I think he welcomed people taking shots at him for being the bad guy, because that's what he did for a living.
Bill was driven more about the art of the music, the art of business, than the money itself.
First Lollapalooza that we ever did, the prerequisite for all the promoters was every promoter had to give in $1,000 and put it into the art gallery or whatever it is they were going to do. Bill Graham spent $35,000.
People just, you know, for a long time had this perception that he was, you know, he had the bag open and the rake with all the money going straight into it.
He's a good guy, and, you know, he puts on all these concerts and everything, but he's a ripoff. He's in it for the money.
And I'll say it just the way he did. It's not the money. It's the money.
He wasn't in the business to make money. However, money's a way of keeping score. And if he can do a little better and prove it, it's not the money, it's the money.
It's not even the money. It's the money that no one knows about, that you put in your pocket in dirty 10s and 5s, in a brown paper bag that no one ever knows about. That's the real money. I think that's what really got him off. I think that was his real fun in the whole thing.
I went and spent a week at his offices going through expenses. I said, Bill, you gross tax. Journey made this, you made this. It's not fair. Journey should have made $25,000 more. He reached for a checkbook and wrote me that check as fast as he possibly could. You appeal to me on fairness. I think you're right. I think that's right. It's fair. This is more fair. Bill, I just spent a week here going crazy. That's right. Don't ever challenge my expenses. Never.
We were always told that groups made more money in the rest of the country than in the Bay Area.
There was also a question as to where that money went. The manner in which Graham kept his books was often challenged, most notably by the Rolling Stones, who questioned gate receipts during the 1981 tour.
You need to maintain relationships in this business. You can't burn bridges. And Bill burned a big bridge with the management of the Stones.
That was always an outsider in terms of the way the Stones did things. I mean, he was, you know, more of a hired gun than he was necessarily part of their team.
When the time came for the Rolling Stones to choose a promoter for its 1989 Steel Wheels tour, Graham was left out.
Money. Somebody came up with a better deal.
The fact that money spoke louder than the experience that he and the members of the Rolling Stones had had in 1981 was pretty demoralizing to him, yeah.
The competing offer was $10 million more. And I remember saying, well, let's give it to him. Bill said, Danny, $10 million, that's $10 million. He says, you're talking about $10 million like it's 50 cents.
He goes back to the band. You know what he said to the band? He said, you mean you would do this to me for a lousy $2 million per man?
So you asked me the reason why he didn't do any other Steel Wheels, and I said business.
I can only relate when he lost the Stones tour as if somebody had lost a lover, and they absolutely had no idea that their lover felt the way they did and were about to leave the other person.
Bill was never the same after that. He got into using a drug called Halcyon, and between being devastated from the Stones and being involved with Halcyon, it really took its toll on Bill.
I think Bill was very depressed from the use of his Halcyon. He was going through a severe life crisis.
I called him and I says, well, you know, are you okay? He says, I'm okay now, but 2 days ago, man, you wouldn't recognize me. I was really down for the count. I felt like I lost the fastball when I lost the Rolling Stones. I felt that everywhere I went, people were pointing out that I didn't have it anymore.
Another time he told me, David could never beat me at basketball. He finally beat me. To lose a game of one-on-one to his son, that affected him. That meant he was getting old.
Weary of the music scene, in 1990, Bill Graham got the chance to return to the art form he loved as a young adult. His movie career was beginning to grow. Graham's minor roles in Apocalypse Now and The Cotton Club were small time compared to his playing Lucky Luciano opposite Warren Beatty and Ben Kingsley in Barry Levinson's Bugsy.
He was scared out of his wits, just frightened of the thought of acting. We did this scene, and Ben looked at him and he said, don't change anything, nothing. Just do that. Barry's gonna love you.
Doing Bugsy was a huge lift for him. After all of these years of doing one thing and then, you know, having in his mind a failure of not getting the Stones tour, well, all of a sudden he hasn't been working on his acting career for 20 years, and here he is, you know, playing Lucky Luciano.
Heading to his 60th birthday, Bill's role in the organization he founded was changing.
He was relinquishing even more of the company to us. We would call him when he would say, when you're on the 1 yard line and you need that goal, call me, wheel me out.
Bill had also begun a relationship with an old friend, Melissa Gold, whom he had romanced nearly 20 years earlier. Newly energized, Graham seemed to regain the spirit within for music and the arts.
We had memories of him as children where he sort of almost became a stepfather at one point and then didn't.
They were trying to ensure the survival of extracurricular activities, specifically the art and music programs in the California State public school system.
She moved a desk table into his office. She was with him all day. She was with him all night. The intimacy that he was in the process of finding with her was something that was very addictive to him, perhaps more addictive than the sense of challenge that he'd found in rock music.
On the night of October 25th, 1991, Graham and Gold went to the nearby Concord Pavilion to see a classic Bay Area band.
Bill was on his way to cover a show at the Concord Pavilion with Huey Lewis, who he had snubbed the night before at Shoreline, had gone to Shoreline, but just couldn't go back to say hi.
He hadn't seen the band. And that was a very unusual situation, to go to a show, be there, and not see the band. More than anything, out of guilt, he ended up going to the Concord Pavilion.
As they had done frequently, Graham and Gold traveled that night by a helicopter, piloted by Steve Killer Kahn.
That night when we were playing, the rain was blowing through the pavilion horizontally. The first thing that he brought up to me was what a scary flight it had been. He said, you know, Mario, I've been flying for my whole career, and he said, this was the first night I've ever been really scared. I told him, I said, hey, Bill, we got room in the car, you know, you don't have to fly if you want. Be happy to give you a lift.
Well, they went off in that helicopter because Bill Graham would look at Killer, and I saw him do this before. I said, are we ready to go, Killer? Killer would look at him and say, yes, boss. You could say no to Bill Graham.
Instead, they took off, heading back toward Graham's Marin County home.
And the dilemma, as it was expressed between the control tower at the Oakland airport and Steve Kahn, was, do they go back or do they go forward? And the answer was, it's not so bad that we can't go forward, we'll go forward. The last recorded communication was the controller in Oakland saying to Steve Kahn, watch out for the wires, a lot of them aren't lit, and you know they're never gonna light the damn things until somebody kills themselves on them.
Well, I got a call from Nick Klanos in the middle of the night. He goes, what color's Bill's helicopter? I said, oh, don't tell me. He goes, yeah, because it was storming outside and everything. He goes, yeah, I think so. And I said, well, it was red. And he goes, oh, I was hoping you wouldn't say red.
Highway 37 in Sonoma County is still closed tonight because of the helicopter crash that killed rock promoter Bill Graham, his pilot, and a female friend.
He was just starting to treat me like a young man. And we were finally starting to break out of our pattern of arguing, or him trying to be the tyrant to me. And right as I was starting to have a real father, he's taken away, he's killed.
I was on the road, and my phone rang, somebody woke me up and told me about it. Whoa.
And I cried, man. I cried like I haven't cried since I was a baby. I mean, I just really cried. That kind of stuff, you know, you can't, you know, it's like you're watching yourself and you can't stop. And my son looked at me and he goes, wow, I didn't know grown-ups did that. And I says, well, you know, they usually don't, but this is something very special. You know, Bill was a special man, and I'm you know, I'm just crushed because I love him and I miss him so much.
Five days after Bill Graham's death, he promoted the biggest show he had ever done.
There wasn't a discussion about, but we don't have artists. We didn't need artists. It was all about Bill Graham, and it wasn't about the artists. So we put in an ad in the paper that just said, come celebrate their lives.
They put on that professional hat of theirs and managed to put together a Bill Graham Presents kind of a show for Bill.
350,000 people came to bid our dad farewell. Now, it obviously helped that the Grateful Dead were there and that Santana was there and that all these bands were there, but the overriding feeling of that day was that everybody was there for our dad. And that was huge.
It was also a tribute to the community, that the audience showed up and came to understand the enormity of the loss of what he had been, what he had done, and what he was about to leave behind.
Let's hear it for the man who's given all of us so much for the last 26 years. A standing ovation and a rousing cheer for Bill Graham. Let him hear it.
But soon after the music stopped, the arguing began as to how to divide up the $35 million estate of a rock and roll icon.
The guy had money everywhere. They were driving his former secretary around town, showing her different banks and saying, does this look familiar? Did you ever stop outside this one? There was $1 million in an account in the Isle of Man. What was that about?
People didn't know what to do with a lot of his estate. And one of the things that happened were, people were coming forward and making claims to something.
Left unsigned on Graham's desk was an updated will, leaving those who remained to debate his final wishes. Soon it would get even more complicated when it was discovered that Bill had a third son.
Esther, primarily, had a problem with this will because it wasn't signed, and at one point, she actually accused me of not being my father's son.
I learned early on to put people in two categories very quickly. People who were in a position and had the interest and need to honor Bill's memory and his legacy, and people who were there primarily to benefit financially from his death. People in the first category across the board were honored and were accommodated. People in the second category, I did my best to shut them out.
After 5 years, the estate was finally settled, and Bill Graham Presents was sold to 15 of its employees for $5 million. 6 years later, it was resold for $65 million. Bill Graham could barely play a note, yet his influence on rock and roll is still felt generations after he first started the music business. Remembered as more than a promoter, Graham's success in creating a memorable music experience will be his legacy around the world.
When Bill Graham died, I no longer had the person to call. And I'm left with, I am the person that people call. But there's nobody for me to call anymore. So I operate on a daily basis at a loss not having Bill in my life.
To this day, I miss him. We don't have anything like Bill Graham in the music business anymore.
We lost the Pied Piper. Where was the action going to come from? Who was going to take us on the next journey to Amnestyville or Live Aidville?
Nobody has shown up to replace the role that he had, the ultimate showman of rock and roll.
The only song Bill Graham ever recorded was I Love You Much Too Much, a Yiddish folk song that had special meaning because of his troubled past. It's a song Graham taught Carlos Santana, who played it at his funeral. Next on A&E, a biography of the year 1975 and the people who helped shape it. For Biography, I'm Harry Smith. Thanks for watching.
Kid, dancer, homecoming princess. What turned 3 California girls into Manson women? Premieres tomorrow at 8/7 Central on A&E. You're either Biography or you're not.
For the web's best bios, log on to biography.com.